हाँ जी. Yeah. Don't worry. I can understand. So I'm just taking it. Majha House. नहीं, just a moment ना. ये Majha House वाला page show कर रहा है progressing. Okay, done. Thank you. Okay. All right. So Preeti ji.
Yes.
Yeah, all set and done. Okay. Yeah. So now we are on the recording live and live on the Facebook.
Ji, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm Preeti Gill, and on behalf of MAJHA House and everyone from the team, I'd like to welcome you all to our online conversation today. This one is on a very complex, hidden away, almost forgotten chapter in our recent history. I'm referring to the 1962 war with China, which some of us may recall as one where we suffered severe setbacks and a humiliating defeat. What we are going to discuss today is the untold account of the internment of about 3,000 Indian Chinese after this war. This was, of course, all of this happened in 62 and it carried on for the next 5 years. It's a strange story and almost unknown. And this is only the second, and I think this is the only second incident in the world when a civilian population consisting of men, women, and children was picked up from their home and sent to a camp. In this instance, it was in Deoli in Rajasthan. And this Deoli Camp used to be a World War II POW camp. The people who were picked up and interned there stayed for about 5 years, even though the war was very much over. Their lives were shattered, families were broken up, and their faith in India and its people and its government severely shaken. They lost everything, homes, properties, businesses, and many of them left India for foreign shores. And they never came back. It's only now that their stories have started to emerge. And I'm really grateful to Teesta Guha Sarkar of Pan Macmillan for putting me in touch with Joy Ma and DILIP D'SOUZA, the authors of the book that we're going to talk about called The Deoliwallahs, and with AANCHAL Malhotra, who will engage them in a conversation. Joy was born at Deoli Camp. She studied in India until she left for the US. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she's joining us from there this evening. For us, it's evening. For her, it's really early. Welcome, Joy. Dilip, once a computer scientist, now writes on political and social issues, on travel, on sport, and mathematics. He has won a number of awards and published 7 books. He lives in Mumbai. Thank you also, Dilip, for joining us today. AANCHAL Malhotra is an oral historian, and she's the author of this lovely book called Remnants of a Separation. She's also won a number of awards for her work. She's the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory, and she's working on Indian soldiers in the First World War these days. As several Indian communities are once again faced with discrimination, this debate around the vital question, who is an Indian, is thrown up again and again. Does an Indian need to look a certain way, dress in a certain way, speak a certain language, pray to a certain god, eat certain food? Or do we inhabit multiple identities, all of them making up a composite whole? In this book and in asking these questions, we learn many lessons for the present, because this question of who is an Indian and who is a foreigner has become so fraught and crucial, and it's a debate that is ongoing even in the present times. Especially when you think about the recent upheavals just before COVID hit us, with the passing of the Citizens Amendment Act and various other things that happened in the country in those days. So we can't really relegate all of these questions to the past. They continue and they're haunting us today as well, which is why we thought this was an important book to pick up, and these are important things to talk about today. Aanchal, I'd like to hand over the baton to you now. Please continue with the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preeti. And firstly, Dilip, Joy, congratulations. What an incredible book. I feel that this should be essential reading for everyone. The first time I ever heard about the camp was about 3 years ago in Singapore when a scholar was giving a presentation on it. And before that, the only time I had heard about Chinese Indians was in Altaf Fatima's Dastak Nado, which has a Chinese Muslim character. It's a pre-partition story. But apart from that, I had never read about them in any literature or any form. So getting this book is not only so topical, but also fascinating in the approach the two of you took to put it together. So to begin the conversation, I'd love for you to tell me about the origin of the book. Joy, this is obviously your family history, and it began with a piece that you wrote for Outlook. And Dilip, you began this journey on a realization about the camp when a friend told you about it, and you had never heard about it before either. So I would love for you to both venture into your origin stories of the book.
You go first.
Thank you. Thanks, Aanchal. Yes, it's quite the story. As you can understand, I live it every day. And so it was actually very, very timely that I had gone to visit India in 2012, and that was coincided with the 50th anniversary of the war. And I met Kai Frieds, who was an editor of a special section on the war and the aftermath. And he just asked me, he said, do you know anybody who might be able to write an oral testimony about this? And don't know whether he knew I was the right age or what have you. And so my first reaction was, no, I don't want to do anything because it was just so close to me. And then I came home and I talked to my mother and I said, this is what he asked. And my mom said, yes, I do want to write about it. And so we just sat in a room and she talked to me and we cried. And I just wrote it in one shot, no editing, nothing. And we sent it over. And I think they just changed one word, changing it from a Hindi word to an English word. And so from that point, I got to meet a lot of other people who were connected with the camp, because I'm much younger than those folks since I was born in the camp. So it took a little while to get in touch with them. And through that conversation, we met Rafiq Elias, and he wanted to do a documentary. And so the documentary was done and ready in 2015, where we took a trip, some of us, and we'll talk a little bit more about the name, the Deoliwallahs, a little bit later. But that's where I met Dilip. And so we were in touch, and Dilip came to the States in 2017 on his way to a protest, which he'll talk about. And that's where I brought up the idea and I said, Dilip, I think we should write this story together. You've never heard of this topic and I have lived it. And so we need you to speak from that perspective. Dilip?
So, you know, I wish I had as emotional a story as Joy to tell about my connection to this story. But in a sense, it was because I heard about this out of the blue one evening in March 2012 when a friend came for dinner, and she's Chinese Indian, and she just, I don't know why exactly, but she just said out of the blue, she said, did you know that we had done this to 3,000 people? And I really had no idea. And it was a stunning experience. It was a stunning mission for me to realize that I didn't know this, that it had happened and that I didn't know it. So in that sense, maybe it was like a blow to me, because I really, in many ways it was a blow. The fact that I didn't know, the fact that I realized that my country had done this. So you know, and then it went from there. I did an article for Caravan that year, based on traveling to some of the areas where some of these people were picked up from, speaking to some people who've been in the camp. And then, as Joy says, I later met her, and then we got talking about doing this book together. It just seemed like you know, I thought there was a book in it, but I was wondering how I could do it on my own. I wasn't sure I could do it on my own. So Joy came along at the right time and the right place, and you know, it just worked out well. So there you are.
I mean, I think that you're right, Joy, in that you need a kind of removal from the event. You need some distance because these things are so intimate and you have lived them every day. For people who either don't have the book or hopefully will pick up the book after this, it is divided quite in a very nice balanced way between Joy and Dilip, where he writes a more sort of political history of what was happening at the time, and Joy goes more into a very social history of what was happening in the camp and what people felt about it, which I think actually works very well. It was a very compelling thing for me to read. I want to know about the history of the Chinese in India and the events that led up to people being interned in the camp, sort of rounded up and incarcerated in this camp. You mentioned Ton Achu and 1776, Warren Hastings, and there are a lot of stories about how Chinese settlers first came to the landmass. So I was wondering if you could give me a little background on how the internment began and why it began.
The internment itself, for the history of the Chinese coming to India?
Well, from the two of you, I think maybe the history of the Chinese coming into India, and then Dilip, maybe from you, a little background on the war and what led to people being interned just after it, sort of rounded up over the next couple of months.
So again, Joy, you want to go?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take it from the perspective of my family and the community in Calcutta and Kalimpong and Darjeeling. So my great grand uncle came to India to work in Assam as a carpenter, a laborer, or what have you. And so he came, I would say, in the late 1880s, and he worked, and then he heard that there was another tea estate area growing up in this area in Alipur Duars called Hashimara. So he went there, and then over time he started this company, and the company is called MAJHA Brothers. So his name was MAJHA, and then he built a company for his brothers. And so he was the oldest. And so he went back to his village and he recruited first his brothers and then other carpenters. And so he built a construction company. And over the years, it became a very big construction company that would do contracts for the neighboring tea gardens. And so a similar area would be Mal Bazaar. So you have this cluster of tea gardens. And so this was going up in the mountains and, in the remote parts of the Northeast. And then in Calcutta, you have this group of Hakka, first with Tong Achu, and then, once one person comes in to a new area, his community or her community follows, right? And so they get built around. So the Hakka are very strong in Calcutta, but they also doesn't mean that there aren't other little groups, because in China is very diverse too. You have the groups from Canton, Hubei, and like India, they have different dialects. They don't dress differently, but certainly their dialects and their food separates each from the other. And so they built a community, and they started migrating, obviously for work, to the Northeast. And so I'll move it on to Dilip.
So yeah, that's some of the history that led up to the history over maybe a couple of hundred years about Chinese coming to India. But so after maybe after our independence, and well, actually even before, we had in 1913 we had the British had a meeting in Simla to try to demarcate the border between. Actually, my understanding was their idea was to demarcate the border between India and Tibet, and make Tibet a sort of buffer zone between India and China. So there was a Chinese representative of the government of that time who refused to sign this and was finally persuaded by the British to merely initial it. So that the Chinese have always maintained that not only that they did not sign it, that they only initialed it, but it wasn't even a regime that now the current day Chinese even recognize. So the history goes back there of their unwillingness to recognize the McMahon line and whatever else we call the border. Now everybody talks about the line of actual control, and also the Chinese, I mean, the border has never been demarcated. So after independence, because we lack this border between the countries, there were a number of incidents where people would, the patrols on both sides would come into contact with each other, and there'd be maybe some shoving and pushing around, or there'd be these incidents of where we accused them of coming into our territory and they accused us of going to their territory, on, and it seemed to me from my reading to get more and more intense as the years went by. And in 1962, at some point, there's a quote that I was just in a sense charmed, but that's not the really right word, but a quote from Mao on a book I have up here, Kissinger's book, where he says something to the effect of how if Nehru's overt gestures of friendship, we better reciprocate them. And what he meant was that he wasn't really talking about friendship. He was talking about what he perceived as Nehru's hostility towards China. And of course, we had that same perception about Chinese coming into India. So and that decided Mao that he was going to give us this blow that we would remember for a long time, and that's what happened in October of 1962. So they came in different parts of the border. They steamrolled into the country, and apart from a few areas where there was some stiff resistance, basically they got as far as they wanted, and then a month later they went back. And the interesting thing is that we had taken some time to wake up to this, but in particular about the Chinese Indians, it was only starting after this war actually ended that people were rounded up and sent to the camp. And so that's the irony of the situation. The incarceration practically, by and large, started after the war was over and lasted for 5 years. In Joy's case, up to 5 years after the war was finished. So
I remember in the book you write something like, because they couldn't get back at China, this was the next best thing, And
they couldn't get, no, I didn't get that.
No, you write something to the effect of this was a way of getting the message across to China by rounding up all the Chinese Indian.
I don't think so. I think it fed into this growing feeling of prejudice and hostility that a lot of people in India had at the time towards Chinese. And what was the most visible, easiest way of giving voice to that? Was to round up these people who look like Chinese and say, to tell the country we are taking action against all these potential spies, and this is our way to show that we're acting against China, and that unfortunately these people paid the price for that.
Joy, did you want to add something?
Oh no, it was. I thought the question was different. It's good.
I was very struck, Dilip, you have this line in the book where you say, should we fall back on the metric of suspicion? And in this case, the metric of suspicion was literally how people looked. And what are the ways in which we label people as the enemy? In some cases, of course, the metaphysical enemy that we don't know. But in this case, the train that actually rounded people up and took them to Deoli in Rajasthan had the words enemy train written on it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people didn't realize why people en route were throwing things and booing at the train, which is, now it's such a heartbreaking circumstance to think of.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the camp itself? What was the camp like, and what was the history of the space? People mentioned that it was a detention camp during the Second World War. So who else had actually been in this camp, and how many people were kept there in this particular instance, and for how long?
Okay, so let me tell you, Joy is the person who will be telling you what the conditions of the camp were, but let me just tell you quickly that the camp has a history going back to, I believe, the middle 19th century. And the British used it for prisoners of various kinds. In World War II, it was apparently used for Germans and Japanese, and I think also Germans who were rounded up, people who were rounded up who were in India. And then it was used also to imprison various Indian freedom fighters. Nehru was there, for example, which is the reason why one of our friends whose story Joy tells, Ian Marsh, wrote her own book, which is called Doing Time with Nehru, because that, Nehru was in that camp. And, other people like S.A. Dange and various others were also in that camp. And then after independence, it was starting to be used for other things. It eventually became a training camp for paramilitary groups. At this point in 1962, it became convenient to use it for Chinese Indians. And that's as far as I can tell, it's the only time since independence when it was used for prisoners, as opposed to a training camp for our paramilitary forces. So, Joy, if you'd like to tell us something about what it was like in the camp.
Yeah, so from my conversations with my mother and other folks who were interned, the one thing that they talk about immediately is the barbed wire. So you can visually imagine this very big compound that is fenced off, and then at the top of the fence you have layers of barbed wire. And so this, and they had guard posts at least on the four corners and then in between. So the guard posts were always manned with soldiers with guns drawn. And so the guard posts, during the day, in the morning, but after a few months, the supplies would come in, the daily rations would come in, and people went to gather that. So, and then I think people would come in and do whatever maintenance they had to do. And so at 6 o'clock, that's when the gates would be shut and anybody who was not a Chinese would be out of the gates. And so, the guards would be always present. You'd have this constant, feeling that you were in the camp. And so one of the people I spoke to, he would try to transcend that. But in doing that, he would go to this old building and he would climb up the stairs and he would go all the way to the top, because from the top, he would get a view that was not interrupted by barbed wires. And as for the other parts of the camp, each family had a room, as it were. One part of the big room was covered. I don't think they had doors even. And then the other part of it was sort of in like a little compound area. So that area was used for cooking or, spilling over of little sort of inside house kind of things. They had cots, they had charpoys, and so that's where people slept because you had to be elevated from the ground. Very dry, parched, sandstorms, as you can imagine in Rajasthan, just blowing through, and the sandstorms start, and they could barely, they would try to block the windows, but there were no real ways to shut the house, so the sand would pour in. One of the things that was sort of really planned well was the supply of water. So they didn't have a lack of water, even though they were in the desert. And in the few years later, they were able to grow vegetables. So there was some greenery. And then because the camp was sort of, like the fences were not really solid, you'd have animals and birds that came in, you'd have peacocks running around. We talk about the hoots or the bird calls of the peacocks, talk about rats skittering across, dogs coming through. So the outside was very much inside, and the animals had freedom, but the people did not. And so whenever you talk to the survivors, it's a sense of desolation. The first thing they talk about, they say nothing, right? They're like, you ask them, how was the camp? Like, that's also a weird question. And they were like, oh, it was boring. And then slowly, as you dig in, then you get the sense of the barbed wire, then you dig in. And so visually and environmentally, they were very locked. And that's the enduring sentiment I get from them.
I think one of the things that they all mentioned is also how there was nothing to do there. So the kids would play football, and as a result of being in the camp, a lot of kids lost their education, and many were never able to restart it again. How long were families there in the camp?
So my family was there the longest, and so through the 5 years, there were people. First, the people left for China, right, in those 3 batches of ships. And then after that, over the next 2, 3, 4 years, people were released. We don't know how they were picked, whether they were sponsored out, or it was deemed that that family should be able to go out. So, to so to your point about there being nothing to do, so you can imagine, at first you lose all education, and then afterwards you just sort of dig in and try to do the best, like gardening or raising chickens, which is what they did. So yeah, there was so the families streamed out over the 5 years, and ours was the last to leave. Some families left to more imprisonment, and some left to just really terrible situations. No support, it's nothing. Come out of the camp, you have nothing, and you're not given any aid besides having to fight for your own rations. So that kind of thing.
When your family left the camp, it was just your mother and your siblings. And you describe your mother's experience of having to be placed somewhere when they came out. And the experience is harrowing to read. And I'm sure it happened to many more people as well. Can you share a little bit about what would have happened to families when they came out of the camp? I know many of them emigrated outside of India as well.
Yeah, sure. So the immigration wasn't immediate. So in the days following their release, usually, so for the families who had people in Calcutta, that was easy, right? The family would pick them up. For the others, they had to shelter in wherever they could. So, excuse me, they would be sent to the school, the Chinese school, that you would sleep on the floor, and then in the morning you pack up and like school starts. And then for one family, I forget which one, they had to stay in a funeral home, and so at 5 a.m. they had to leave because there was somebody coming in. There's a dead body coming in, and they had to pack up and go. So so basically, a lot of the families, they had to struggle, and the kids had to work immediately, right? So if you're a teenager and you're a boy, you have to fend for the family. You have to start earning. And so for all the people I covered, they had to immediately find shelter with some distant family. And then over the next weeks, they had to get a small barsati, and then, then they got a little bigger place. And then as they started earning, they were able to get bigger places, because some of them had fairly large families. And then when things did not improve, they started looking to immigrate. And I think at the time, Canada was looking for skilled workers. There had been, so people from the shipyards had gone to Canada, and then they just needed probably regular immigration, and people just took that opportunity to leave.
I want to talk about the ways in which the event and the years of incarceration are actually remembered within the community. I would imagine there's a sense of fear and deep betrayal attached to it. There's also a sense of helplessness. In the beginning of the book, I'm really struck. There's a letter that is written during 2017 Doklam standoff, in which people write, the words that are used by the community are, "We have been trying our best to remain as invisible as possible." And throughout the book, when I read it, this line stayed with me. How does a community become invisible? And what is the vocabulary of that invisible or deliberately silenced trauma and the stigma associated with the camp? The two of you did considerable number of oral history interviews. Dilip, I know you did as well. Towards the end of the book, they come in. And I would love to know what the sense of how the community actually talks about the event over the last several years.
So can I say something about that letter, actually?
Yes.
Because it was, so this is really, so let me a quick recap. It came because in 2017, the community in Toronto, where there's a large number of these people who've emigrated there, decided to try and go to the Indian High Commission in Ottawa and hand over a letter saying that we would like an official acknowledgement and an apology for what happened to us. And so this was in the planning, as I understand it, for several months. So sometime in those months, in the course of 2017, this friend in India who knew this was happening wrote to them saying, you know, exactly as you said, you know, we've been trying so long to be invisible, and you guys, certainly you need to take the decision that you have to, but you need to be aware of the repercussions or possible repercussions on us here in India. That was the tone of the letter. And you know, I was also struck by just as you say about how is it that a community becomes invisible or thinks of itself as invisible, and the answer to me is look at the way all of us have forgotten that this happened. It's not that they need to be invisible, it's just become that way. If none of us know about it, none of us even have thought about it, then you know they are invisible. And the proof of that is in how, for example, like Yin, again, whose story Joy tells, talks about how she, many years later, she met some of her schoolmates. And these were people who she was in school with at the time she was taken to the camp. And so one of them asks her, so, you know, what the hell happened to you? Where did you go? And she asks him, are you serious? You really don't know what happened to me? And it's true, he did not know. And, you know, that's how invisible they are. They didn't, in a sense, I don't even feel like they need to do anything to become invisible. They've just, we've helped them along in that sense. You know?
Mm. Mm.
I will say for the community who is still in India, every time there's some bubbling up of the border issue, ripples of fear just go through the community. And if you think of it, you know, like basically what do we all want in life? We want to be able to work, we want to be able to contribute, and we want to be able to live peacefully, right? And so that is no different from the goals of the Chinese Indian community. They're deeply rooted in, they've been there for generations, lived their lives there, they're friends, they eat Indian food, and likewise the Indians eat Chinese food. And so, you know, they more celebrate the things that bring us together, which is food and, you know, cultural music and things like that. So for the community that's outside of India, I think that shame and guilt sort of was there for some years. And then now when they meet, it's more about, you know, more recent things, you know, that dominate them. And it wasn't till the 50th anniversary where we really like looked at the thing and said, you know, what's going on here? The other thing I do want to touch upon, which you brought up, is the stigma. And so the stigma in the early days followed the people who left the camp, right? And so when they came out, for just from personal experience, my mother didn't go and visit people because people were afraid. For instance, you know, you talk about when my mother was just let out of the camp and she was trying to find a place to stay that very night. The officials were so, she was the last person left, you know, and they just wanted her out of their hands. They wanted to go home, you know, and like be with their families. And so they finally found a place to get her to. And so they loaded everybody up in a big truck, and the police came, and they didn't come like just following my mother with a lathi or a stick or something. They came with their guns drawn. Here's my mother with 3 little children, and these folks are just standing like protecting them, I suppose, you know, around them with their guns drawn. And so when they walked into this building where this alleged relative was supposed to be for my family, and so they go there, and everybody like pokes their head out, and they look, and what do they see? They see these armed men, guns drawn, and they just scattered. Like nobody, everybody's like, I don't know, you know, and they just left. And so that kind of, you know, like singling out, you know, like Ying Marsh talks about it, you know, when she was led, also escorted by armed guards, you know, through, they had a short walk to the truck. And so during that short walk, everybody in their neighborhood had come out to watch them. And you're talking about a 13-year-old kid. All she felt was shame. What have we done? What have I done? Why am I being treated like a criminal? And so a lot of the teenagers who went to Deoli, that's what they felt, and it stayed with them for many, many years. And so sometimes they talk about those things, but I think they've worked it out over the years. And so I just want to close with, so do they talk about Deoli in a healthy way? I suppose they can laugh about certain things. You know, they laugh about the camel that they think they were fed. They laugh about the how hard the bread was. And then there's this woman whose mother calls her Deoli, and that's her name, and everybody knows her as Deoli. I think she even has it perhaps in her email. And she was just, you know, cool about it. And I was like baffled. You know, she was also born in Deoli, and her mother talked about how when, you know, after she had the baby, she had to eat yogurt, right? So that's the only thing she could really eat to build her health back.
And this term, the Deoliwallahs, you mentioned in the book that we called ourselves the Deoliwallahs even before the idea of this book came into fruition. How do people use this term? Is it careful? Is it calculated? Does it have a certain weight attached to it?
So I wanted to clarify, the people who call themselves the Deoliwallahs were those people who went in 2015 to India. And that's where we met DILIP. So it's a very small, that little group that went with the documentary, because we were like, what should we call ourselves? And somebody said Deoliwallahs, and I was like, oh, you know. So basically it's the people of Deoli, which is absolutely true, right? And so now I think when we type in Deoli, you know, the camp pops up because of the book. But they talk more in Chinese about the camp. So the camp in Chinese is called Yuan. You know, it just means a gathering together place. It's like euphemism. But they just say more Deoli. My family calls it more camp. You know, so my mom would say, "Oh, he's a camp wala." You know, so we know he's from the camp. But the other people, the ones in Toronto, when they talk about Deoli, they name the town. And that's what binds that community together.
And Joy, you mentioned at the very beginning of our talk that this is a history that you have literally lived with your whole life. You were born in the camp, and how I want to get a sense of how it felt to talk to certain people. There are many instances in the book where people say to you, I remember holding you as a baby, and I remember we were so happy that you were there. And then another instant that you mentioned in the book is when you get out of the camp and you're telling your parents, how are there no photographs of me as a child? And it just really stuck with me that you were so fixated on it. Like, why are there no photographs of me as a child? And then your mother said that we can go to the zoo and take some photographs of you, and you were okay with it. So how did it feel to enter into something that was already so personal?
Can I interrupt there, and before Joy goes? She doesn't often tell the story, and I have to prompt her, but since she mentioned about this person who's named Deoli, now, Joy, I'm going to tell them this time.
Okay.
You know, she's named Joy for a reason, and I really think that is telling, because her mother was pregnant with her when she was sent to the camp, and her mother was, you know, it wasn't a pleasant experience in the camp, let's put it mildly. And then Joy was born in November that year, October, right? I mean, she was sent to the camp in January, and 9 months later, Joy is born. And this was the one moment of joy that her mother had for herself, and that's exactly why Joy is called Joy. And I really think, I think that story needs to be told again and again.
I agree.
I forget it. So yeah, my poor mom.
But tell me about the process of interviewing, especially your family and so many people that are so close to you.
Yeah, so you know, when you live it, we don't talk about all the time. Like, I think as now we're under shelter in place, and through the writing of the book, my mom talked about it a little more, because when you're growing up and you're little, you know, what do you tell? But the one thing I do want to say is, and I'll probably delve into this in a future book or something, is all I knew was the camp. The camp was my home. And so you can imagine how miserable it was for a little kid to come out and just be kind of terrified of the world. And so basically I had to unpack all these things, you know. So first you have the photo, and then my parents would tell me the story about everybody, you know, who was associated with different photos that we actually saw. And so that's how I got into what my family was about. So there was a great sense of pride of what my family had accomplished, what they were doing, and almost epic kind of stories about them. And then I would meet people, and the people would say, "Oh my God, she's all grown up. How lovely! I knew you when you were a little kid. Stuck to my mother's side." And so when my mom came to Calcutta, she had to take me everywhere. There was no childcare, right? So I would go with her everywhere, and so I got to meet all these people. And as I grew older, they always said, "You need to write a book. You need to write a book." But it was really difficult because when you're young, you want to strike out on your own. You don't want to be held back by whatever the family wanted to do. And then also there was no appetite for that book because like as you know, nobody knows about this book, right? And so in the US, people just didn't know what to do. You tell somebody the story and their jaws just drop and they don't know how to process it. And so I just I just understood, and so my agent, who actually my best friend's sister, she had approached me and said, we really want to write this book. And then she was able to go to TISTA. But as you unpack it, I feel that even now, when my mother tells me something, I go and research it. It makes those connections that I never had before, to give a better perspective of how our story is really the results of global economic, socio-economic migrations of people, right? So the Chinese migrated to India to help build the tea industry because the British brought them for their expertise. And so with that came certain things, then you're grandfathered into a country that doesn't really know how to process you, but you were born there. And so there's some understanding that you belong, but how do you belong, right? So it's pretty complicated. It's pretty interesting to see your life as a part of, all our lives are connected with the times we live in, but in this great case, it goes further back.
But actually, your answer moves perfectly into the next question about Eva Cheng's story. I think there are so many instances in the book where I stopped for a minute and reread what I had read, but Eva Cheng's chapter about talking on generational memory and inheriting the memories of her father in the camp and feeling the same sort of fear and sense of unbelonging that you talk about. There's a line that she says, and it's just stayed with me. She says that there's just such a disconnect in understanding human suffering. And she says that because she's living in America, where, as you rightly say, no one knows the story. And when you tell someone, she says this as well, their jaws drop and they don't quite know what to say. And she says that they've carried themselves very quietly. Even when someone bullied them in school in California, they carried themselves very quietly, which is very telling and also quite parallel to the invisibility that we were speaking about earlier. I want you both to kind of talk about the generational impact of this event, because I think for me, Eva Cheng's chapter is the heart of the book. It shows what will be carried on and what will be forgotten.
Yeah, so I'll give it a shot first. So for Eva's a very special girl. So she truly understood her father after a while, right? All she actually first encountered was when they would talk about the camp, right? Michael would just go dark and silent because the burden of it was so heavy for him. He was 6 when he went to the camp, but he suffered a lot after he got out, and he had to, build himself up again. But for Eva, that's what we try. This book is trying to talk about, like how an event affects people, not just you, it's your family. And so I know that this event affects my family. It affects my brother's children. It just permeates, because sometimes I'll talk to my mother and my mother would say, then we should go telling us all these stories that we kind of have heard before. But Eva was also very thoughtful. So what she tried to do was consume and understand all this, whereas not a lot of her peers would do that. They would just say, okay, that's dad, we'll just move along. We'll think of happier things and how to struggle and survive. But she actually went and she researched these people. And like my experience, she would say, how was the camp? You know, again, where do you start with this story like that? And they would say, oh, it was boring, right? And so again, feeling through the layers. And she also understands her privilege compared to what her father went through. And so that self-awareness and that understanding also colors her thinking of how to think about where she is right now. Is this the country? You know, what is this country doing? And all those questions bubble up. So, and when I wrote that chapter, I didn't tell Dilip and Tista, but they picked it up, and I know Dilip was really moved by that chapter.
Yeah, I gathered on social media when I also posted about it.
Yeah, I really was. I think, like you said, I really think it's the heart of the book, and it's the real lesson for all of us. It's not just. I mean, in a sense, I'm a generation later than that war. I was 2 years old when it happened, but here's a generation even further removed, and they feel it too. And it for some reason, not for some reason. I mean, it really draws parallels to we should look at the parallels in Nazi Germany, how the subsequent generations have had to deal with this, the trauma of what happened in Germany at the time. And it's taken those 2-3 generations and their experiences, their felt experiences that you know, give us a sense. It's almost more of a sense of what that did to the country. And I think we should be looking at that too, in terms of what this experience has done to the generation that come later. The only thing I'd like to add to that is an experience that I had with somebody I went to interview in Calcutta. Just say this very quickly. So I was sitting and talking to him. This is a man who'd not even been in the camp, but he was just part of the community and he knew everybody in the community. And while I was sitting there talking to him, his phone kept beeping with SMSs from somebody who somehow had divined. I don't even know, he didn't know and I didn't know that how this guy had found out that I had come to visit him to talk about the camp. And he was sending all these crazy messages about how, you know, we've been through trauma and, you know, are we going to be suffering this again and again, and how long are we going to continue with this? And this was 50 years after the war had happened, and he's sending these SMSs to my friend for no apparent reason. And these were coming every 2 or 3 minutes for the 45 minutes or an hour that I was there. And it again, that little episode told me something about the memory and the trauma of what had happened to this community.
Absolutely. I remember reading that, and I remember you being quite bewildered.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, he was bewildered and I was, yeah.
Right. We mentioned earlier on the notion of apology and what does apology mean. And in the book, you make a comparison with the Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, 1942 in America, and why there was no intervention on the part of the Indian government when Chinese Indians were taken into the camp. And given the topical nature, the unfortunately topical nature of this book at the moment, and the very seething parallels with what we have just seen in terms of the CAA and detention centers being made and people being rounded up quite similarly, I want to ask, what can we learn from this event? What do you think is the greatest takeaway from this book? You know, Dilip, your aftermath chapter is so telling in everything that has not just happened since then, but everything that has recently happened to us in the last couple of months. And the outrage that we have seen. You talk about, you know, the Facebook group, who is an Indian, what is an Indian, the comparison, go to Pakistan. These are things that have now become commonplace, you know, this vocabulary that's commonplace. So how are things forgotten over time like this, and how can we learn from it?
Well, I'd like, can I go first, Joy?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, let me just say, I really think those parallels are so stark. What's happening with CAA and NRC is, you know, for better or worse, it's been blotted out by COVID. But there were parallels, not just in the detention camps, but in the questions it raised that we had to answer about who's an Indian and who's a foreigner, who's not a citizen, how do we define citizenship? All these questions that the Chinese Indians had to face in 1962 are now being posed to all of us, and it's not unreal at all, because the combination of the CAA and the NRC put it together, it's unmistakable. It's you cannot escape from it. It's going to result in people being asked to prove their citizenship in some way or the other, and those guys who cannot prove it will not be given that fast track, and not only that, they will be put into detention camps. It's just the same as what happened to the Chinese Indians. And I mean, it baffles me and it saddens me that we cannot learn from what we did in 1962. This is a great mistake that we made then. Maybe you think, I already have people who've told me, oh yeah, but the Japanese Americans were 100,000 and these were only 3,000. Therefore, that was much worse. I mean, is it only the numbers that make it much worse? That makes no sense to me. The fact is that we destroyed the lives of 3,000 of our fellow citizens. And that's something that this country should be deeply ashamed of. I think there's a strong case for an apology, but I'm totally pessimistic about this country ever giving that apology to these people. But I wish at least that our book serves as some kind of catalyst for people to remember that this happened and to start introspecting about it.
Mm-hmm.
Joy, it's yours.
Yeah. So, so I think what the situation Chinese Indians face is that they're visually different. And so whenever there's some reason for prejudice, they're singled out easily, as are the people in the Northeast, right? So anybody who looks Asian, East Asian is called all sorts of names, or just, and so I think also where, I don't know what we can do about it, is when leaders allow this thing to happen, they enable it. We have it here in the United States. We have some people in ministers in India talking about banning Chinese food. And so that's where we can really sort of educate. And I think the main focus of this book would be education and awareness. I want to go into a room where I talk to people I haven't met before, that 1 or 2 people know about this, instead of everybody not knowing. And we also need to think about things that unite us. It's food, it's art and culture, and so on. And so when people say ban on Chinese food, it really shows that there is no division in their head, that there's some military things and governmental things versus civilian things. And so that's to me the crux of all this. The civilians in India were the ones who were victims. Civilians who did nothing, had nothing to do with that war. And so if we can build that awareness, we can build people to understand that, you have to be able to separate it. Do all the people who went to the camp never speak to Indian people? No, they have friends, they have deep relationships. They don't think of it that way. And so neither should everybody else. So if we can move that needle, great. And the long-term goal is an acknowledgement and apology. And that's what the group in Toronto will be upholding.
Well, I do think that your book is, it's a really big step in the right direction. And I would urge, I want to shout about it from the rooftops, because it's not just about the fact that this particular event happened, but it talks in general about the human condition. It talks about human suffering. It talks about the importance of people's voices. I think for me, it affected me so deeply because I too am an oral historian and I work with partition. But the fact that people's voices remain the strongest sources of information for us to understand the human condition. I think that I'm grateful to the two of you for writing this book.
And may I say, Anchal, that I think that that's a parallel too. What happened at partition is something that we should be able to now, 70, 75 years later, look back on with some perspective and acknowledge some of what went on. And
right.
Oral history, like you're talking about, are the way for us to do that.
Right. Dilip, I remember at the beginning of the book, you had a little sidebar conversation about 1971, where you were talking about 1962, but asking, was physicality the only way that people were rounded up? And if so, after 1971, how would you know if someone is a Muslim?
Yes, exactly.
Right? Like, how would you possibly... Right. And this is a question I'm faced with a lot. Like, I tell people you wouldn't even know if a Pakistani is in front of you because they look exactly like you. Anyway, I see a lot of questions here on the chat, and I would love to I would love to ask some of these audience questions for the next couple of minutes. So let's...
Shall I ask them, or would you like to read them out?
Go ahead. Yeah, why not? I think you may have collated them a little bit.
I've just got 3 right now.
Okay.
The first question is to Joy. Is there an Indo-Chinese identity among the Chinese who stayed on in India?
Oh yes, definitely. They have chosen to stay in India, and they love their lives there, and they feel completely Indian. They talk in Hindi, they eat Indian food. You know, they live and breathe the country they live in. So the identity of those people who live there, and a lot of them have assimilated, and you know, as far as intermarriages. So some of them, you if you didn't see their faces, you wouldn't even know that they were not originally, I guess, a certain type of Indian, you know, like the accepted idea of what an Indian is.
You know, I have a photograph from when I was in China, in Chinatown of 7 or 8 years ago, of these 2 kids running towards me. And, you know, it was almost an unsettling experience for me, as sad to say, because they looked Chinese, yes, but they're running towards me, and I took these pictures because it was quite a striking picture. But they're chattering to each other like school kids everywhere else in the country. They're chatting to each other in Hindi, and they're standing around me chattering in Hindi. And it was, you know, that says exactly what Joy is talking about.
There's a comment from somebody called Manpreet Sahota, and he says he teaches in Toronto, and a few years ago he had a student of Chinese heritage who spoke impeccable Hindi. Imagine my surprise when she shared her family history with me and told me that she's Indo-Chinese. Yeah, I think that's, and then there are comments from people who are all saying that they had no idea about this story, and they feel ashamed that they didn't know anything about it.
Join the club. I'm saying join the gang.
Yeah. There's another question for both of you, and this is that has any attempt been made to collect and archive other stories that must be in every family?
Well, so let me take a shot at this. So I was talking to to a journalist yesterday, and I told them basically the Chinese Indian community is pretty low-key. They're not terribly outspoken. They for reasons that you can understand. You know, even if they were not outspoken, they got interned, or people they knew got interned, and they're afraid. And so so the people who want to speak are in the book. There are a couple other books that were written, and a lot of people don't want to delve into it because it's a terrible, terrible history. It's a terrible memory. Why would they want to go there, right? And so, and the other thing, it's 50 years hence, right? So a lot of people have passed on. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, and a lot of people just their children haven't believed, like Eva has, that their stories are worth talking about. So it's pretty difficult. You just have a handful of people who are willing to be the spokespeople. So we try to encourage it, but it's difficult.
But Eva herself has put together some oral histories on a blog, right?
Yeah, so that's available actually on the AIDCI website. I can put that on the chat over here. So you can read there about 3 stories. Let me dig it out. Let me get the chat.
Yeah, that'll be helpful. Kishore Thukral had a question because I think both he and Inakshi remember Shillong. And Kishore was asking, where were people picked up from? So of course you've mentioned a lot of places in the book, and then in Shillong, he particularly remembers families called the Tatung, Sifu Chong, and Hobson and Sons. And did they also get picked up? Does anybody know?
Who was picked up from Shillong?
Sorry, I'm interrupting. This is Shimla. I'm talking about Shimla, not Shillong.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I thought you said.
No idea. And I don't have.
No, I don't have any idea about people from Shimla.
I think the thing that
I do. Uma. Yeah, well, as a kid, we had the Chinese shoe shop And we used to get all our shoes made from them. They were the best. My father would take us, and once a year we would get those shoes made. They were really fabulous. They lasted us for 1 year.
Yeah, shoes are popular.
I think one of the things that struck me was that children were picked up from the schools as well. You know, they were rounded up. There's someone's chapter where he was unsure of how many books to take and shoes and everything.
In fact, in school in Shillong, if I remember right, was that Michael Joy?
Andy.
Andy,
It was
Andy.
Andy Shea.
Andy Shea was picked up from school in Shillong. Yes.
And he took his football shoes because, yeah, he was told it would just be a week, but he did take his books, and then he ended up being a tutor, I think, in
the camp.
Oh, here we go. I think this is it.
There's a question from Kathleen Shannon saying, have you talked to anyone who was responsible for rounding these people up? It is harder to understand what they were thinking and how they could participate in such a thing if we want to stop something like this happening again.
I don't have access to these people, so Dilip would have to talk.
Somebody asked me, in fact, just a couple of days ago, if I had been in touch with the commandant of the camp, and I thought it was a good question. I wish I'd made some effort to find out what happened to him. Maybe I don't know if he's alive or dead, or his family is around. But that's right. You know, it would be good to, before too many more years go and they all vanish, to try and track down some people who did some of this rounding up and ask them what were their motivations, or not motivation, because they had their orders presumably, but how did they carry out their orders, and what were the laws that were cited to them about how to do that?
Dilip, you actually touch on a little bit of it when you spoke to some military personnel right at the beginning of the book on the ongoings of the war, at least. I mean, so that's a good place to
that's
begin.
true, but those guys, those two, I mean, gave me an interesting perspective there. Both of them said that this is something that happens in wars, and you have to deal with that. It's and they both said yes, there's a case for an apology, and we should. What we really should have done is, once we rounded these up, interrogate the people and just send home the people who are innocent. There was no case for putting them into the camp. But they both said that you got to remember that every country has a right to look for spies or people who might be turned coats in their midst. I'm not sure I totally agree, but I felt I had to tell people that's what these military guys felt.
Sorry, isn't it written into the Constitution that the government has the right to round up anybody of foreign origin? I think it's written into the Constitution. Yeah.
Well, it's encoded in all the laws that we passed at the time, Joy. As you know,
right.
There was a Foreigners Act.
That's right.
Acts that gave our authorities at the time I like to call it a legal fig leaf, but I mean the authority to round up people like Joy and her mother. I mean, it had to be done under a legal framework. It was not just that they went and rounded up these people. And that framework was the laws that we gave ourselves at that time, in absolutely in late 1962 and early 1963. In that period of a few months, we gave ourselves all those laws.
Sorry, there's something from Sanjay Hazarika saying, I've pressed for an apology with the government and in my own writings, but the response wasn't encouraging. The prejudice continues against those who look different, and how little we've learned.
Absolutely. What else is there to say? But yes, that's true. How little we've learned.
I hope
appreciate that you did that.
After your
having like so many other stories, this is another hidden story because.
No, can I just come in for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. Because I've been listening very carefully to both Joy, Dilip, and your moderator. I think the fact of the matter is that this effort, I went in fact to somebody very high up in the government about 4 or 5 years ago. When Joy, I think you had come and spoken at the India International Center about this issue about 4 or 5 years ago.
2015. Yeah.
2015. So that time I went to actually before that also, I went to the person who was very high up in the home ministry, not a minister, but an official, the highest rank in the the home secretary. He said that this is something, and he agreed this was something that should be done. But then it was his last few days, and things in India don't, like in most governments, don't move. There's no sustainability of issues. And I think I'm just concerned about the fact, despite all the work that all of us have done for so many years, this absolute stupid ignorance that continues to drive people, especially in the northern part of this country and in other parts of the country also, with regard to looks. Like when you have this coronavirus, you have people from the Northeast being called corona, or being spat at or attacked or abused, Um, and there is so little that's changed. It really makes you wonder when the change will come, despite all that we do, all that we write, all that we advocate, the cases we file against people. And the fact that I think that 90%, maybe 75% of the people in this room didn't even know this existed. And we are still talking in this country about camps, putting people in camps. That is absolutely outrageous, I think. It shows how little there's been a change. I'm sorry.
I'm glad you used the word stupid.
It is. There's nothing less than that, especially when people can do all sorts of things on social media that they can't just do a little.
Well, I have to say that I don't think every effort is in vain. I think it moves the needle a little bit. It's just very slow and takes so much time. It's a deeply emotional piece. So thank you for what you've done, Sanjoy, and hope you continue to support it, because we do need people to keep talking about the issue, because it's going to help self-awareness, and that will help a lot of things. We're really talking about a humanitarian wrong that was committed, and it doesn't change anything. It's always there, and we need to talk more and make people aware of it.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I don't represent anybody except myself, and I come from Assam, and I know I've driven through some of these areas like Tinsukia and so on. I mean, obviously, because my father's from Subsagar. But, for whatever it's worth, I'm really sorry you went through that. And I'm very glad you've shared your testimony. You've borne witness. And that's what writers have to do. I'm sorry, my video is not. And that's what writers have to do. We have to essentially bear witness. Hi, Dilip. Hi, everybody. I have this little thing on my camera which says you're being surveyed. So just close the camera.
So now there are dogs barking at us too.
The dog doesn't like it.
But no, I just, of course, Sanjay, we all know, all of us in journalism and history for sure know who Sanjay Hazarika is, and it's true, a tremendous amount of work that he's done that we should be grateful for. But I think it's true. All of us who now know the story, at least on our behalf and on whoever we represent, should be apologizing to this community. Sorry, Joy, that this happened to you.
Yeah, no, I know. You guys are supporters. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? There's another question here.
Jaspreet Singh who's asking, out of curiosity, does the Chinese government view the community as part of its diaspora, and have they expressed any position on this issue?
They have not expressed any position on the issue. I think the support that they offered was the ships taking people to China in 1963, and so other than that, there isn't much they can do. It's almost an internal Indian problem, because these people have been born there. They don't have Chinese citizenship, or they chose not to go to China, so they don't have, as far as I know. I don't know. Dilip, do you know anything? I don't know.
No, I mean, you're right about the Chinese ships, but I think that the one thing that I uncovered when I was doing my reading and research was some paper, it's in the book, I don't offhand remember which one, that talks about how a Chinese statement that was put out at the time of the war about the Deoli camp. And it's talked about how Chinese citizens were being put into the camp. So that these guys, I mean, whoever put out the statement, it was some kind of semi-official statement, did not even know that these were not Chinese citizens, actually. These were people who were rounded up from within India. So I think they just, they don't much, there hasn't been much awareness or certainly interest in the Chinese government in this issue. We did at one of our events, if you remember in March, Joy, when we had our conversation with Raghu Karnar, there was the Chinese Consul General, I guess that's what they call him here in Bombay, who came to the event. And then he gave a long statement about Chinese-Indian long bonds of friendship and so on. Fair enough, but I don't think he really addressed the issue of the camp. There you are.
Yeah. It would be hard to, I think.
Okay. The dogs are at it again.
Preeti, I don't think that there are any more questions from our end.
Yeah, that's it, I think. If Indu, if you're there, would you like to make the concluding remarks now?
Yeah, hello everyone. And Joy Ma and DILIP D'SOUZA and AANCHAL MALHOTRA. And I think MAJHA House has done a wonderful job of this revelation, because none of us knew what was happening, what had happened rather. And it's such a sad thing that we, being Indians, we are supposed to be a secular country with diverse, religions, everything. And we are not able to accept people into our fold, And regarding education and awareness, I think it's been quite a few years now. If we don't learn today, we will never learn. And partition also happened. We have not learned. The same theory is going on and on again. And when you say, okay, who is an Indian? Today, I think the same history is being repeated. There are different views to being an Indian. Maybe religion, maybe your, whatever you can say, the situation everybody's well aware of. And I think singling out an Indian is going to be very difficult with the same things that detention camps are being made and, people are being harassed and CAG, NCR, NRC and CAA, all that is happening. If COVID hadn't happened, I think things would have become worse. But being humans, we must consider that every human is the same. Religion, origin, or caste, creed does not come into this. Humans are humans. And if the trauma, the trauma centers that they're building up, I think they are not needed. What people need is empathy, love, and, bringing them into your fold. And I went through the preview of the book also, and the Deoliwallahs, and it was very saddening that children are born in the camps, in detention camps, and this thing. Everybody has a right to live, and live in peace and live with respect. So I think we all have to stand up for this. If not today, then never. So I think it was a beautiful MAJHA House initiative that we all got together, and I think each one of us has to put in a little contribution to try and fight it out. If each one has the determination to fight it out, I think we can kind of bring things, to a peaceful level. Well, thank you so much, MAJHA House and all the panelists here. And it was wonderful meeting and wonderful evening. And so much was unraveled, because I think we had never known about the tale of the Deoliwallahs till today. So I thank you so much, and be safe, and God bless all. We are one, and we will always remain one in spite of, the forces which try and, separate us with caste, creed, and religion. But I think that's it. God help us all. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you.
Buy the book.
Yes,
yeah.
please buy the book.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Joy, for sharing your story with us all, and for Dilip and Aanchal for this really great conversation, because it was deeply moving, it was personal, and it's also deeply troubling to listen to all of this. So thank you. I just wanted to also say that our next session on Saturday coming up, 18th, is a book called The Indian Army by General Panag. I hope all of you will be there, or everybody who's interested will be there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Anchal.
Thank you, Anchal.
Thank you.
It was my
Bye.
pleasure entirely.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.